I want to welcome everybody. This is our Pennoni panel. It's our term. Every term we do a Pennoni panel on some topic of some possible controversy or importance in controversy, I like to say. There may be several perspectives that can be brought to bear on the issue, or it can be an outright source of controversy within the society. We do one every term, and it's part of our Center for Civil Discourse, which we've been working on for some time, and some of you know about it, and some of you don't. We'll be expanding it with the help of some people here. The idea is to speak across difference with civility and to listen well, and that's the concept behind it. So before we start, I just want to tell you about a couple of events that are coming up with the Pennoni Honors College. We are going to continue the conversation about labor next week with Wednesdays at Bentley, which is a monthly discussion with the community where we talk about issues. And usually these are issues distinct from our Pennoni panel, but we thought it would be fun to continue this. And where's Melinda? Melinda Lewis oversees this. She sends out articles in advance on both sides of the issue, so I assume she'll do it pro and anti-labor union. And we have lively conversations. What's interesting about this is that we get people of all ages, which we have here, as well as students. So we've had people who live in retirement communities and so forth come on Zoom. We're going to try and move more and more toward live events. And this is, I think, part of the problem here is that people are used to joining on Zoom, which can be more convenient but less interesting. So that will be next week, October 12th, Wednesday, from 5:30 to 6:30. We also will be having an art exhibition in this space. You may have seen the Post-its that are around. That's for the work. This is a fascinating exhibition. Some of you know Karen Sams. Her neighbor, she had a neighbor who was a recluse and spent his whole life copying old master paintings. And when he died last year, hundreds of these paintings were found in his apartment by his sisters. I mean, his sisters knew and had some in their homes, but so many of these paintings, and we were given permission to put these up. And we're going to have a little exhibition on this floor with some of his books, and he did them in colored pencil, which is even more extraordinary. And so I really invite you to come. This will be October 17th through November 4th in this space. So you can wander by to see the work, and there will be about 40 of his pencil paintings, because they're in colored pencil, and they look very, very much like the originals. Finally, we will be hosting our first Can We Talk event, and we have the moderators here today, Haris Sokolov and Chris Satullo. This will be held on Tuesday, October 25th, on this floor from 7 to 9. And the program began at the University of Pennsylvania next door. It's now in its 7th year, and it offers moderated small group discussion in a welcoming environment. It's now part of the Pennoni Honors College Center for Civil Discourse, and it will offer counsel and tips about productive conversation that you can use on campus, online, at work, and with your family. The idea is to talk across difference of opinion, which can be difficult, as many of you know, even within your own family, or maybe especially within your own family. This can be a challenging endeavor. And I'm looking forward to it because I would like some tips. And they have had great success, our two gentlemen here. They have professional moderators that will come in and help students do this. So this is very exciting. So now on for our program today. We have an exceptionally wide-ranging panel. I want to thank our Marketing and Media Center for Civil Discourse group, Brian Kantorak, Melinda Lewis, and the director, Erica Zellinger, for putting this together. I will introduce the moderator, and then he will introduce the panelists, or have them introduce themselves. So, Dr. Tristan Potter, there he is, will serve as moderator. He is an assistant professor here at Drexel in the School of Economics within the LeBeau College of Business at Drexel. Unlike many schools which have economics in arts and sciences, we have it in LeBeau. I was just talking to Tristan about that. He teaches courses related to labor economics, macroeconomics, and econometrics, and his research focuses on issues relating to unemployment, wages, and labor market policy. So we're very glad to have him here, and he will take over. Tristan.
Thank you so much, Dean Cohen, and thanks to everybody who has helped to organize this, in particular the Pennoni Honors College and the Center for Civil Discourse. So we're really excited to be doing this. This is a really topical issue right now, unions and the future of labor. So I'll leave it to Stephen Greenhouse, the authority here, to give us the full history. But very briefly, right, in the United States, the history of labor movements goes back to at least the Industrial Revolution. And since that time, we've seen the kind of strength of labor ebb and flow. Labor really gained a foothold in the FDR New Deal era in the 1930s, and kind of reached its zenith in the power of labor reached its zenith in the 1950s. And since then, as is kind of widely documented, the strength of labor unions, the private sector at least, has declined significantly in the United States, something that we haven't seen in other countries quite so much. So that happened for about 50 or 60 years, and that brings us to the Great Recession and today. And what we see now is what looks like, and I'll be interested in our panelists' thoughts on this, a resurgence in the strength of unions and labor representation in the United States. So you can see this if you look at opinion data. So if you poll people in the US, you see, so I think a Gallup poll recently in 2021 showed that 68% of US households supported unions, and that's kind of a super high number compared with what we've seen in the last 50 years in the United States. Probably you have to go back to 1965 to see comparable numbers. Also, we can think about specific examples, of course. You can think about, everyone's heard about Starbucks, unionization efforts at Starbucks, at Amazon, at REI, at Chipotle, the list goes on. So we're in a moment where it seems really appropriate to have this conversation, and we have, of course, a wonderful and diverse group of panelists here to weigh in and to talk through some of these issues. So I won't introduce you all, let you introduce yourselves. So you could just say a little bit about yourselves and maybe how your work relates to, or how you have kind of worked with unions in the past to frame the conversation. So maybe we start on my right and go left. Okay. So Richard.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Hooker Jr. I am the principal officer of Teamsters Local 623. We represent about 5,000 workers. We represent all the UPS workers in Philadelphia and Delaware County, and a small group of workers in the Greyhound facility downtown. I started with UPS 1999, warehouse worker, became a shop steward. I wanted to get more active in the relationship between the employer and the worker, because, in my eyes, and I gotta take my emotions out of this, I think all employers are bad people. I apologize if I offend anybody, but that's just the way I feel. You work hard, you should be treated with dignity and respect. It's not just about wages. You want to make sure that when you come to work, you can go home the way you went to work. So I got more involved. We started a caucus in 2015 called 623 Lives Matter, because Teamsters Local 623, so we wanted to combine a social issue with the worker issue and combine it to fight the employer. So we did that. Took us 5 years. It manifested into us getting elected for office, and ever since then, in 2019, when we won, we've been just revamping our members on what unions are supposed to look like and what they are supposed to do. We work for the member. We work for the worker, not for the employer. And so we've been trying to change that dynamic among our workforce so they can see that when you pay union dues, you get something back for them. So that's kind of the crux of Richard E. Hooker Jr.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tristan, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alex Halper. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. We're the statewide Chamber of Commerce, so we're a membership organization. Our members are employers, the folks Richard was talking about before. About 10,000 of them throughout Pennsylvania, crossing all industry sectors. The vast majority of our members are small businesses, far fewer than 100 employees. And in every region of Pennsylvania, all 67 counties, we have members. We work with employers on compliance with laws, with kind of a range of different areas, but primarily we are an advocacy organization. So our department works closely with elected officials in Harrisburg, state representatives, state senators, the governor's office, administrative, the executive branch agencies, and our goal is to improve Pennsylvania's economy, improve the business climate, and make Pennsylvania attractive to businesses, both for employers who are already here. We want them to stay in Pennsylvania. We want them to hopefully grow and create jobs, but also for businesses all over the country and increasingly around the world. We are in a constant competition with other states and other countries to attract businesses to locate here. We have great needs in Pennsylvania. Every year when the legislature develops the budget for the state, for the next fiscal year, there is tremendous demand for programs and resources and support for residents and communities. And that takes a lot of money. On the other hand, we all pay taxes. Nobody wants to pay higher taxes, Pennsylvania employers included. So there's this constant tension of we want government to do more, to do a lot, but we also don't want to raise taxes. The answer is simple, and that's more taxpayers. We need more people in Pennsylvania, more employers paying taxes, more employers hiring people. Pennsylvania, for the last 100 years or so, we just got through this every 10-year reapportionment and census redistricting process of counting the people and determining how many members of Congress we have. Pennsylvania back in the 30s, we're talking about the New Deal time, Pennsylvania had 34, 36 members of Congress. We're going to be down to 17 in the next congressional session. That is a huge problem for a range of reasons we probably can't get into, but the point is increasing Pennsylvania's population, increasing taxpayers requires a strong business community, a strong economic base, and that's our mission. It gets us involved in a lot of policy areas where the labor community is also involved. Sometimes we're partnering on issues. Oftentimes we are not partnering issues and we're bringing different perspectives, but a big part of our job involves interaction with the labor community, their representatives in Harrisburg. Again, just an honor to be part of this very distinguished group. I'm honored to be here. Dad's a 75 graduate, chemical engineer. We've been talking about co-ops since I was a really young kid. He told me when I was here I was supposed to rub some statue for good luck.
Oh, the toe, right?
That's the toe.
A.K. Drexel, yeah.
So Dad will be happy I mentioned that, and I thank you again.
Hi, my name is Denise Kaiser. I'm a partner with Ballard Spahr. We're a Center City-based law firm, one of the 100 largest law firms in the country. And I am the practice leader for the Labor and Employment Group. I have, my clients are those people that I think Richard suggested were always bad guys. I have
Always.
I cannot.
Always.
I cannot agree with that. I have spent my career representing management and representing employers in labor and employment matters. So I've handled strikes, grievances, arbitrations, union organizing campaigns, lawsuits, wrongful discharge, and things like that. And I would respectfully disagree, and I think we'll have a few, I guess, other disagreements as well. there are differences of opinion. Labor is often on one side, as Alex mentioned, and employers are often on the other side, but not always. And there often are some shared interests among employers and unions. But I will give the employer perspective. I think I'm kind of embedded. That's embedded within me, and I have spent my career representing them. And again, I can't say they're bad guys. I spent 40 years with them, so. But thank you for having me.
Thanks, Stephen.
Sure. So my name's Steve Greenhouse. Sorry I can't join you. I'm in my apartment in New York City. I'm honored to speak to the Pennoni Honors Program. Thanks for the introduction, Dean Cohn. So I'm retired now after having worked 31 years as a reporter for the New York Times. I was in Chicago for 3 years as the paper's Midwest economics correspondent. I was in Paris, France for 5 years as the paper's European economics correspondent. I was in Washington for 4 years covering the State Department and foreign policy. Then I started covering labor for the paper, and I covered labor and workplace matters for 19 years. And I wrote about, everything. I wrote about, difficult lives of farm workers in Florida and California and Washington State. I wrote about strikes by steelworkers in Western Pennsylvania. I wrote about horrible sweatshop conditions for apparel workers in Bangladesh. I wrote about some companies that do a great job in how they treat their workers. Not all employers are bad. Costco, which is a Teamster unionized company. Patagonia, another one, does a wonderful job in how they treat their workers. I wrote about unions' role in politics, and I wrote about the AFL-CIO, and now is I've been writing about labor probably since before many of you were born, and I've never seen such an exciting time for labor. I speak to young people and they say labor is in. I speak to college students, I speak to 23-year-olds. It's like, wow, this has really changed. I'll talk a lot more about that later, but it's very nice to be here. Oh, I should mention, I've also written several books, The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker, and Beaten Down, Worked Up, the history of workers in the United States. And I wrote those books because in my 19 years writing about workers in the United States, I saw that something was really broken. I saw that corporate profits year after year reached record levels. Wall Street, Dow Jones Industrial Average, year after year reached record levels. Productivity per worker per hour, year after year reached record levels. But wages for many, many, many workers basically remained flat, didn't go up. And many worker benefits, whether pensions or health coverage, were getting worse. And I was concerned about this disconnect between how corporations in the top 5 or 10% were doing and how typical Americans were doing. And that has been a very big concern among economists and certainly in American politics nowadays.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Yeah. So I think we have a good sense now of where people stand on the issue, at least in broad strokes, which is good. Spare me a question. So yeah, I think to set the background and give some context to the discussion, maybe we start and go straight back to you, Steve, and I'll ask you, can you help us put in historical perspective the role that unions have played in the United States? What issues, from the point of view of labor, have they sought to redress? What have they wanted to redress? What have they tried to and been unable to deal with? And how has that evolved over the last 50 or 60 years?
That's a great question. Thank you. So I think, when I speak to young people, I often speak to college audiences, a lot of people take, things for granted. They take the 5-day work week for granted. They take having pretty good wages for granted. They take having health coverage, maybe good retirement benefits. And I often think of that bumper sticker, which we've probably all seen, unions, the folks who brought you the weekend. And, many Americans used to work 7 days a week. Why do we need unions? They used to be child labor. Kids 12, 13, 14, 15 used to work in coal mines. Rail workers, who worked very hard in dangerous jobs. They'd live in company towns and the rents would be incredibly high and they'd have a hard time keeping up. Coal miners, used to be, before unions were strong, that hundreds of coal miners would die each year, many of them in Western Pennsylvania, many of them in Eastern Pennsylvania as well. In my book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, Future of American Labor, I write about a garment worker in New York City, Clara Lemlich, an immigrant from Ukraine, a country that's been in the news a lot lately. You know, she wrote that when she worked as a garment worker, many workers worked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. 7 days a week. She complained that she never saw the sun. She'd go into work before the sun came up, and she'd leave work after the sun went down. She said, the shop we worked in had no central heating, no electric power. The hissing of the machines, the yelling of the foreman made life unbearable. To the foreman, Lemlich said, the girls are merely part of the machines they are running. The apparel workers are often cheated, not paid for all the piecework they completed, and not for all the hours they worked. At one factory, a manager tricked the workers by moving the clock's hour hand back to 5 o'clock when it was already 6 o'clock. Some factories locked their exit doors to ensure that workers didn't sneak away with garments. Clara Lemlich was struck, dismayed by all the unfriendly factory signs. Laughing is forbidden. Talking is forbidden. She said forbidden was one of the first words she learned in the English language. So I just mentioned locked exits. So a few years later, there's this horrible fire in New York City, the Triangle Fire, where 146 workers died. That was a humongously important story in the history of America, in the history of American industry. That really triggered cities and states and companies to do a much better job in worker safety. And unions played a big role in pressuring companies to do a good job to ensure that workers are safe. And as Tristan just said, the Depression was a big time when unions really gained power. So many workers are so poor that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal Congress decided we have to give workers more bargaining power because they are so poor and their wages are so low. So they passed a law to make it much easier to unionize, the National Labor Relations Act. And at the time, nowadays we think of like auto jobs and steel jobs, or like good, high-paying, solid industrial jobs. Back in the 1930s, these were really lousy jobs. They were dangerous jobs. You might get laid off for 6 months a year while your factory was retooling. And there were these huge strikes to pressure, these major companies. General Motors, then the largest, richest company in the United States, faced a huge strike, the Flint sit-down strike, where finally workers, got General Motors to agree to recognize a union and to bargain to make conditions better. And in my book, Beaten Down, Work Up, I quote an Alfred Lockhart, a GM worker who was overjoyed by the results of the strike. He said, the inhuman high speed is no more. We now have a voice. We are now treated as human beings and not as part of the machinery. It proves clearly that united we stand, divided or alone we fall. And I'll just conclude right now by saying, after World War II, coming out of depression with all the unionization, unions are much stronger, but still, typical American workers, whether at United States Steel in Pittsburgh or Ford Motor Company or Chrysler, they were not in the middle class. The companies were doing very well after World War II, and the union said, we're not getting our fair share. And there's a series of huge historic strikes in the United States by many of our parents and grandparents were involved, maybe great-grandparents. And as a result of these strikes, they got these humongously powerful companies, General Motors, Ford, United States Steel, to finally start paying workers middle-class wages. And as a result of that, the United States really built the world's largest middle class, where workers finally were able to afford to buy houses for themselves and the family, where workers were able finally to afford to buy cars. So I think unions played a huge role in creating and producing the middle class of the United States, and that middle class, many of us continue to enjoy a generation or two or three later.
Okay, thanks so much. That's a great answer. So I want to turn it over to Denise now and get your thoughts on this. So what I hear from Steve, I think, is that the principal functions of unions is to kind of implement protections for workers, for labor in general, and this is kind of been historically the role that they've played. I guess my question for you, as somebody who's represented employers in labor disputes, is do you see, how do you see policymakers as being ought to, how should policymakers go about kind of protecting labor, perhaps through union, but perhaps otherwise? What's the role of policy in protecting workers and protecting workers' rights?
Well, That's a good question. That's a great question. And let me answer it this way. Policy, U.S. labor policy is incredibly important to both employers, to commerce, and to unions, and to employees, of course. And so what's the role of policy? Well, let me talk a little bit about how policy changes, to give everybody a background here. Labor policy has been a little bit of a pendulum in the United States, swinging from one way under Republican administrations to the opposite direction under Democratic administrations. And this helps nobody, I think, really. You know, many employers are happy to see Republican administrations. They know the labor policy is going to be more pro-business. Many Democratic voters are happy to see, many unions are happy to see Democrats elected because the pendulum's going to swing the other way. But, you know, the swing, I think, is a problem for the U.S. and has been a problem for labor and for employers for many, many years. And President Biden now talks about being the self-proclaimed most pro-union president ever, and he's taken real action to back up that pledge, right? The other guy, as President Biden refers to his predecessor, he was a very different president and a very different set of policy agendas. I think we can agree on that. And we see this swing most obviously in decisions of the National Labor Relations Board. That's the board, that's the agency that governs essentially labor relations, employer and union relations. And that board, under different administrations, swings back and forth. They reverse precedent under Republican administrations, they reverse precedent again under Democratic administrations over and over again. And this makes it impossible for employers or unions to really know what the rules are. What are the rules of engagement? What are the rules of the game? How are we supposed to order our relationships with each other? It doesn't do anyone any good to say, well, maybe this will change, or maybe this is about to change. Maybe we can do this, maybe we can't do this. And over the 40 years that I've been practicing labor and employment law, I've seen it change back and forth. It becomes very difficult to have, to understand what the ground rules are so that each side can then order what they want to do and put their priorities in order. For example, the NLRB has just changed the rules on whether employers have to continue to deduct union dues after a contract expires. They've flip-flopped on whether graduate students are employees who can have the protections of unions and can they organize. They flip-flopped a bit, the NLRB, on whether nuances of the legal definition of protected concerted activity. If an employee wants to do X, is that protected by the law, or can he or she be fired? And so I think it's important from a policy standpoint, if you define it as the rules that are out there, that we get some consistency. I've often said to people, and maybe my clients would disagree, but I don't always care so much what the rules are, just tell me what they are, and then we all can engage each other and on understanding what employers can do, what the rights employees have, what rights unions have. So it's helpful if there's greater consistency. Labor policy, I think, in the United States needs to be help everybody by being more predictable and more consistency. If you define policy on rules, that's kind of what I see. If you define policy more broadly, the bully pulpit of the presidency is extremely important. You look at, and it does change, I think, and can have the effect of changing how people react and how people see unions and see employers. Look, for example, at President Reagan and the air traffic controllers. He fired them, and suddenly employers seem to be, at least in my own anecdotal evidence, and I've seen this reported as well, all of a sudden employers were like, yeah, let's take a hard line. Now we have President Biden, who is given unionization and organizing his wholehearted endorsement, and you see a change in how Americans think about unions. I'm not saying he made the change himself, but he certainly, I think, reinforced it in either leading or reinforcing that change. You'll see a different atmosphere now. So labor policy matters both on the granular rules level and then also on the overall sort of presidential bully pulpit level.
Makes sense, thanks. So yeah, if Alex or Richard, if you all want to weigh in on this, I'm curious your take on how we might protect workers effectively, as you know, Steve was suggesting that unions have done historically, whether through unions or there are other ways that you think this ought to be done. I think this is something we can all get behind to some degree, right? You know, ensuring some basic level of protections for labor. So the question, I guess, is how. So either of you all.
Oh, sure. No, I think Stephen offered a very informative and kind of interesting history of the labor movement and how successful it was in providing those protections. So workplaces were not safe. So Congress passed and the President signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act and created OSHA. There were children working, and often in unsafe jobs, so child labor laws were passed. People weren't able to organize and form unions, so they passed the National Labor Relations Act. Wages weren't, there wasn't a floor for wages, so minimum wage was passed, overtime. There's no doubt that the labor community and workers in general and the policymakers who were kind of developing that level of protection back during the New Deal period, back during the Roosevelt administration, can point to a lot of successes. I think, but I was not part of the state chamber back then. I was not involved in those discussions, and I think what we're involved in now, from a public policy standpoint, it looks a lot different. And some of the policy areas where we often find ourselves interacting with the labor community is not really what I imagined it would be kind of when I started working on behalf of employers. So for example, just thinking about some really recent topical issues. And many of these are not like the huge big ticket front page of the newspaper stuff, but they're important to our members. So for example, grocery stores recently got the ability, many of them, to sell beer or wine in the store. That alone was a huge accomplishment to finally move past that kind of system that had been around for decades. A lot of our grocery store members who are having trouble hiring workers wanted to be able to get rid of the requirement that alcohol sales occur at a separate cash register. They couldn't find the people to staff that separate cash register, so they said, well, look, it's the 21st century. Can we have adults buying their groceries and buying a bottle of wine, do it at one cash register? We thought that made sense. I think polling showed the overwhelming of Pennsylvanians thought it made sense. We butted heads with a labor union. The bill has not moved. A few years ago, we're talking about public pension systems and trying to update pensions to reflect the evolving demographics of workers, and retirees are no longer working for, or no longer retired for 4 years, as was the case when the systems were created. They're now retired for 30 years, and the numbers don't work anymore. So there was talk of trying to update that system. That was opposed by some of our friends in the labor community. Even when we talk about the National Labor Relations Act and the laws that dictate how you form a union, one of the kind of core tenets of that law had been, when the workers finally are voting, that it's a private ballot. One of the main initiatives of many in the labor community have been to get rid of the private ballot. So when I think about our work with the labor community, again, looking just at those areas where there's some disagreement, we're not talking about children in mines, and we're not talking about adults in unsafe working conditions. There's an entire system and bureaucracy in place intended to enforce and protect those laws that were passed almost 100 years ago. But you also have, so what we experience now is very challenging discussions on other issues which we think are helpful to employers, helpful to consumers, and the economy in general, that we often find challenges moving forward. So I think there's a very impressive and laudable history to the labor community. There's no doubt about it. It's a matter of how do we approach some of these issues going forward.
Those are really interesting examples. So yeah, Rich, if you want to weigh in on this.
So when it comes to policy, I would say this. We have to make sure that whatever's in place actually works for the worker. What worked for my great-grandfather is not going to work for the worker today. So we need to look back at the policy, see what's going on in the area of workers. Like again, what worked back then is not going to work now. $7.25 is the minimum wage. That was set back then. $7.25 can't even get you two gallons of gas now. So when it comes to policy and things like that, we need to make sure it changes with the worker. When the workers change, the laws that protect workers need to also change.
So yeah, it's really interesting. So I guess what I'm hearing is, on one side that it sounds like maybe what unions are doing is quite different substantively than what they were doing in the past. But then also I think it's certainly true, right, that minimum wages are set in nominal terms, right, and so they're not automatically adjusted for inflation. So we also see, kind of implicitly labor market policy changing over time in the opposite direction. So it's an interesting contrast.
If I may just briefly, the minimum wage example I think is a good one. It was set back in the 30s at 25 cents an hour, and the majority of individuals and employers subject to the minimum wage were adults, were the primary breadwinners for the family. And the idea was to create a minimum, a floor for families to make sure that those who were the breadwinners for the family were able to make a living. As we've seen, over the decades, the population of who's earning the minimum wage has also evolved. And the state puts out a report every year that outlines who's earning the minimum wage, and it's overwhelmingly they don't have children, they're younger, they're often living in households earning well above, I think a quarter live in households earning over $100,000. So even something like minimum wage, which had this very intentional purpose back in the 30s, as demographics and the economy has evolved, the fact that as policymakers and really as a society, we focus so much on something like minimum wage as a kind of primary tool for combating poverty when the majority of people earning the minimum wage are not in poverty, I think shows that there is sometimes this disconnect between public policy that was developed and conceived back 100 years ago and how things have evolved over time. I think you ask most policymakers, you ask most employers and people, should there be policies to make sure people people can take care of their families? Absolutely. Do we think minimum wage is the best way to do that? That's where we have some disagreements.
Okay, so yeah, thanks. I should avoid this becoming a minimum wage debate, which we can have plenty of as well. Yeah, so these are really interesting kind of range of opinions here. So
I don't just to
by
make
all
a
means.
comment. I mean, I don't mean my prior comments to reflect an idea that policy should be static or in stone. But I do think that U.S. labor policy since the New Deal, since my whole life has swung back and forth, and from an employer, and I think also from a union standpoint, at least on the granular level with rules and sort of the basic chunks of what's protected activity, what kind of organizing will work, what are the rules on that. There really should be some consistency so that both sides can order how they act and how they act with respect to each other. I know, you mentioned, Alex mentioned this idea that of the secret ballot election. That has been something that has been really a centerpiece of the National Labor Relations Act and a centerpiece of U.S. democracy, right? I mean, a free, fair, and private election where no one knows how you vote is it works for the presidency, it works for elected senators and almost all of our other elected officials. It should work for electing unions, and there is deciding whether you're going to be represented by a union. And there has been a lot of push by unions to try to eliminate that and to simply be able to require that employers recognize people on a petition. But a petition, of course, that's not how we elect anybody else. That's not how we elect the president. You can be bullied into signing a petition. You can sign a petition just to get the organizer off your back. And how many of us have signed petitions because we didn't want to walk past somebody who was standing in front of us on the sidewalk, and you're like, okay, fine, sure, what is this for? So I think that's an important part of it, and that is a rule that I would think, as Alex mentioned, should be the centerpiece of U.S. labor policy. And many Democratic administrations have talked about changing it. Unions have wanted to change it. I think it's not something that people would really support changing.
Could I just respond? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, Denise, I appreciate your comments, but I disagree with you on the history. As you probably know, when the National Labor Relations Act was signed, it allowed unions to form when the majority of the workers signed pro-union cards. The majority sign-up as a very popular way of unionizing at the time. And one could also have secret ballot elections. My sense, and I think you know this, is that many unions are happy to have secret ballot elections. What really bothers them is that they'll petition the National Labor Relations Board. 60-70% of the workers at a workplace will sign cards saying we want a union, and the company will say no, we're not going to recognize you based on this showing of 70% support for the union. We're going to require a secret ballot election. Now, what really upsets the union is that between the time the petition is turned in and the 4 or 5 or 8 weeks an election is held, the company does a massive, often intimidating anti-union campaign that persuades, and pressures and scares many workers to eventually vote against the union. So the union feels we started with 70-80% of the workers supporting the union, but as a result of management's high-pressure campaign, we ended up losing the election because so many people were so scared of losing their jobs or whatever that only 45% voted for the union, so we lost the union election. So I imagine many unions would be very, 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 very happy to continue to have secret ballot elections if something were done so that it was a much more even playing field, so that management did not have much more access to the workers than the union does.
Well, I hear you. I understand what you're saying, you still can. Employers still can choose to recognize a union on a petition, but most employers will ask for a secret ballot election. And there is a free speech clause to the labor laws that allows both sides to talk to their employers. Employers will talk to employees at the office, at the workplace, in the factory, where they're working. What's interesting to see, and I understand that employer advocates and labor advocates will disagree on those campaigns by employers. I used a lot of words that I think are a little bit loaded in terms of a massive, intimidating type of campaign. But both sides have the opportunity to present their case. And when petitions are being signed, the employer doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to talk to employees on that. They may not know that the organizing is going on. What's interesting about organizing now is that union organizers we're seeing are very social media savvy. It's the explosion that we've seen in union organizing currently over the since the pandemic, during the pandemic, have really come among workers who are, I think, younger, who are more social media savvy, who have a favorable view of unions, very favorable view of unions. I think, Tristan, you mentioned before that unions now have a very high favorability rating, and among younger people between 25 and 35, or 18 and 35, it's a very, very high approval rating. Unions for years used to be, down around approval ratings like Congress gets. Now, they're up way up in the stratosphere, and those union organizers, those unions, are able to use those skills, the social media and other ways to organize. It's not the same as it used to be many, many years ago, where they'd be organizing with just pickets out front or billboards out front or flyers. And so they have an opportunity to talk to people on social media, to deal with them directly, to convince them to sign the petition ahead of time, and then when the employer is talking to them at work, the union can then address those issues in essentially a private conversation on social media, on Facebook, on things like that. So they have been very savvy and very able to really move into the 21st century, the current spate of organizing that we've seen.
So we'll come back to this issue of how the nature of the labor market has changed in the last few years and how that's affected the labor relations. I want to, since we're in Philadelphia and here at Drexel, kind of refocus the conversation briefly, and I guess I'm interested in both your opinion, Alex, and your opinion, Richard, also on the nature of unions in Philadelphia and the state of unions in Philadelphia in particular. So, as I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but so the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there was
on strike.
Still going.
Right, still going right.
Okay, still going. So I checked a few days ago, and this was in the second week, I guess. So historically, Philadelphia has been a kind of major nexus of labor activity. What explains that, and what's the state of labor and unions in Philadelphia today? So we'll start with you, and then talk about.
Well, I think what's going on in Philly right now is an upsurge in union activity because of the pandemic. I think workers were already on the tipping point, but then once COVID happened, you saw corporations and America's dependency on the worker. Corporations' profits skyrocketed, all these kinds of massive profits, and I mean, they were just making money hand over fist. But what did the worker get? So the worker said, you know what? We're going to get active. We're going to mobilize. We're going to organize. We're going to do whatever we can to get some of those profits. Because without the worker, there is no profit. Without the worker, there is no corporation. And so I think that's what you see here now in Philly with the armies and workers. They've been without a contract for 2 years. Why is that?
Yeah.
So they had enough. But I don't think they do that if COVID doesn't happen. COVID pushed a lot of workers to the breaking point. I just can't take it anymore. I'm coming to work, like for an example, UPS workers. Oh my goodness. Amazon, UPS workers, we delivered everything because you couldn't go to the store. When the COVID vaccine was available, we delivered that to the hospitals. So everything America needed was delivered in a brown truck. Who drove the brown truck? The worker. So, now you see this resurgence and this more aggressive attitude within the workers' community because they've had enough. They want to fight back. They have leverage. They have power because we've seen what's the commercial with Dunkin' Donuts? America runs on Dunkin'. That's not it. America runs on labor. Without labor, America shuts down during the pandemic. Nothing moves, nothing happens. And so I think the American workers saw that, they feel that. Again, go back to the workers at UPS. We had workers working 60, 70 hours a week, not seeing their spouses. And then the company telling them if you don't come to work, you could be disciplined. I just gave you 50 hours. How am I going to be disciplined? But again, going back to what I said earlier, no disrespect, corporations have they have a hard time to understand where their profits come from. You know what I mean? But workers, I think after the pandemic, they see that without us, there is no corporation. So we had our members actually had to, before they could go into their homes, had to take off their clothes because they didn't want to bring COVID home to their families. Now, CEOs were making all kind of money, but our workers had to make a decision on, hey man, do I want to possibly infect my family members? So a lot of those things, they played on the workers' mind, and now you see why this is happening, like why you see the Starbucks, why you see the PMA, why you see Trader Joe's, why you see all these really up, Home Depot.
I didn't mention them, yeah.
Right. They now starting to trying to get a union because they seen what happened over the last 2 years and how America has depended solely on the worker. I cannot stress that enough. America does not run without the worker.
So yeah, that's super interesting, and we'll come back to this question of, I think, whether that will be a durable change, right? I think that's an open question.
I'm not going to agree with you that often, but I do want to stay for
Yeah.
the record.
We'll take all the agreement we can get here.
I do agree.
I appreciate that.
Take all the agreement we can get.
Right.
I do really think that COVID has really changed the calculus, because I think people really did see a lot of the things that Rich is talking about, and the idea of group action or collective action became more appealing to people who had never really thought about it before, never or never really given it a serious thought before, and COVID really teed it up for people to take a look at. So I mean, I do think that you're absolutely right that has had a big impact in changing the calculus in terms of whether employees want to organize and whether they will take the next step to actually organize.
That last part is key, because before, do I want to organize a union? Do I want to organize my workplace? After COVID, there's no question. We have to. It's not do I want to. It's now we have to.
Yeah. So Alex, what's your take on kind of the state of things in Philadelphia, either the PMA workers or more
Yeah.
generally?
No, I will also agree with Richard that the pandemic, I think, was a kind of a turning point or a major factor in the trends that we're seeing now, both with more organizing campaigns, but especially the campaigns focused on smaller businesses. I mean, it has been a exceptionally difficult time, I know, for everybody, for all of us. And I'm not even talking about the health, the health part of it, which is of course heartbreaking, but from an employer standpoint and an economic standpoint, also heartbreaking. And businesses, forced to shut down, businesses that have been operating for decades, profitably, small businesses, your restaurants, small retail, forced to shut down. And many of them never reopened. And the ones that did reopen, found that they were now, rightfully so, but subject to extremely burdensome and expensive health and safety mandates. And they found that when they, finally could reopen, finally start making a profit, people weren't coming back to work, and they couldn't, restaurants couldn't fill shifts, and they finally had the chance, and they weren't, they didn't have the people. Then you pile on, inflation and disruptions in the supply chain. I think you had an employer community that perhaps has never been as vulnerable as it is. You combine that with a severe workforce shortage, which is still going on, which we could probably do another whole segment on why that exists, but employers just can't find the people. Combine that with an administration in Washington, and as was stated, President Biden talked about being the most pro-labor president ever, and that is not just talking points, that is real. You look at the policies being pursued by the National Labor Relations Board and the Department of Labor. I think all of these factors combined created this really perfect opportunity for organized labor to, again, not only expand the employers who were the kind of targeted with organizing campaigns, but the size. We're hearing from so many small businesses saying, we never in our wildest dreams thought that we would have to kind of work through an organizing campaign. We didn't think it makes sense, and now they're dealing with it, and they don't know what to do. There was just a report out of Harrisburg, where I live, of a pizza shop that, long story short, shut down abruptly. They'd only been around for a few years. Community loved them. They were in our local kind of farmers market. Shut down abruptly. You find out later, now they denied it had anything to do with it, but they were the target of an organizing campaign. And again, not talking about them because they said it had nothing to do with it, but think about a business that was shut down for a year, couldn't make a profit, and then couldn't get people, and then this kind of adds one more layer of complication. And I think, again, it makes for kind of a perfect moment for the labor community. Is it sustainable? I guess we'll see.
Yeah, I think
Can
that's
I
good.
just say my 2 cents? Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, by all means.
So I totally agree with Alex that
Agree.
Never was it a more vulnerable time for small businesses. They were having a hard time getting workers. And a big reason why they're having such a hard time getting workers is many workers felt that they never had such a vulnerable time. Workers at the beginning of the, many workers, grocery workers, pharmacy workers, bus drivers, hospital workers, meatpacking workers, they were hailed as essential workers, as frontline workers. We honored them. They were sticking their necks out every day. They were hailed by, editorial boards, by people in Congress. But these workers, while they felt, hey, we've won all this respect, we're no longer invisible, they didn't see much more money going into their paycheck, and they felt, we're risking our lives every day taking the bus to work. We're risking our lives every day standing at the Trader Joe's or Kroger cash register, ringing up groceries. And meanwhile, while these folks are making $10, $12 an hour, all these white-collar workers who are making $150,000, $200,000 a year are working at home in safety. Meanwhile, the CEOs during the pandemic, were often very uninhibitedly increasing their pay from $15 million to $17 million to $18 million a year. And a lot of these, heroic essential workers say, wait a second, there's something really wrong here. We're risking our lives every day. We're hardly getting any extra pay whatsoever. Many workers complained that they weren't given the personal protective equipment that they needed. I wrote about some immigrant McDonald's workers in California who were given coffee filters to wear, to protect them from COVID, or were given doggy diapers to wear to protect them from COVID. They went on strike to protest. In a million years, these workers never thought they'd go on strike. So a lot of workers, as a result of the pandemic, felt very angry and aggrieved. And that's why we're seeing the Home Depot workers at Philadelphia seeking to unionize. At the Philadelphia Museum of Art, a lot of workers were upset that they were laid off, and then other workers were called back in, but they weren't called back in, and they felt it wasn't fair. So I think a lot of workers felt a great sense of injustice during the pandemic, and that's pushed a lot of Starbucks workers and Chipotle workers and Trader Joe's workers and Amazon workers to say, how can I improve my lot at work to make things better, to increase our pay, to make things safer, to give us a greater say in how this place is run. And that sentiment, plus the very low unemployment rate, which has given workers a greater sense of power that if they don't like it here, if they get fired for trying to form a union, they could always get a job across the street. So I think and last thing, tying to what I think Denise was saying, and during the pandemic, unions really learned very well how to use social media in a way that they didn't before, and I think that has helped them win many of the unionization campaigns that they might have lost before. Before the pandemic, my sense is the playing field was very much tilted against unions when there were union elections, because management has access to the workers 24 hours a day. Managers could talk to workers, they can show anti-union videos in the cafeteria. I once wrote a big story about the largest employer in Pennsylvania, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. They had anti-union screensavers on everyone's computer. They had, in the break room, they had anti-union videos. And meanwhile, under American law, under Supreme Court decision, companies can absolutely prohibit union organizers from setting foot on company property. They can't even put flyers on cars in the company parking lot. So it is a very invigorating time for unions, because workers are so angry and jazzed about many workers are so angry and jazzed about how they were treated during the pandemic, and that's why so many workers dropped out of the workforce, and that's why so many small businesses are having a hard time finding enough workers.
So I have lots more questions. I will, however, defer to our audience and pass it along to you all. So I'll open it up. If anybody wants to ask our panelists, go ahead.
I'll start.
Sure.
Fascinating, all of you. But what I'm hearing is that there are small businesses, and this is Alex's point, and then there are corporations, and all the examples that you are giving, Richard, and that Stephen is giving, and I don't know who your clients are, Denise, but are corporations, and where it's very different from a pizzeria, or possibly even a museum. I don't know what that story is. But since so much of the problem in this country has to do with a class divide, then it seems to me these small business owners are in the same position in many ways as the workers, but the corporate people and the white-collar workers at Goldman Sachs or whatever are making these huge salaries. So the whole notion of a worker, when we're talking about a worker, who are we actually talking about? And how when we talk about unions, don't we have to distinguish between these smaller businesses and these large, hugely money-making corporations? I don't know, I don't have the economic vocabulary to say this right, but I think you know what I'm saying. And is there another way in which we can configure this whole situation? And I don't know who can answer that.
That's a really good question.
Can we change the world, I think is the question.
Yeah, but it seems to me that we're using a voted vocabulary here that isn't taking into account certain inequities relating to class that are so powerful right now that didn't exist in the same way before, although there were divisions of class before, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did anyone want to speak to this? Yeah.
Yeah, can we pass? I mean, are we allowed to just? Are you going to grade us on every question that we have to answer, or are there some that we can just skip?
Yeah, I know.
I'll take a shot at it, and I think you guys got to support me, so
Yeah,
I'll let you
yeah,
guys
yeah.
Jump in, and you can criticize me or join in. But let me take a shot at it. I think class is a big issue in the United States. Every time you pick up the newspaper, right, there's talking about a class divide, and so. The labor policy isn't really set up to deal with that, other than to say, that managers and supervisors can't unionize. They're not. If Florida wants to let them, that's fine. But the law protects the right of workers to rank and file workers, right? They could be white collar workers, they could be office workers, they could be Amazon delivery men or Chipotle workers. Those people all can organize, and beyond that. And so there is a little bit of a sort of set out under the law, right? The law is focusing on protecting the rights, the National Labor Relations Act, of the most vulnerable employees. They're not protecting managers, supervisors, lawyers, Goldman Sachs executives. But I think it's artificial to say, well, there's big corporations and their little businesses, and let's realign their interests, because I mean Yes, I think smaller employers often have much more difficulty dealing with a union organizing campaign because they may be operating on a smaller margin. But larger corporations too, or larger businesses too, I mean, the law recognizes that they have rights, and the point of the National Labor Relations Act and the whole idea of union elections is to give both sides the opportunity to talk to those workers and to present their side of the story. The unions do it generally off premises, the employers do it on premises. And there are Stephen is using a lot of loaded terms in terms of anti-union messages and intimidating tactics, and those are, to some extent, those are forbidden. There's a line that's been drawn by the National Labor Relations Board as to what can and cannot do, and this goes back a little bit to what I was saying before in terms of the pendulum swinging a bit. But there are set ground rules, and I don't know that labor policy is going to be able to solve all the class issues, but just in terms of what we're talking about, the union organizing, the protected right to organize, is addressed to some of the to the general rank and file workers.
Well, I mean, I would only add, I mean, it's an interesting question, at least making this distinction between small businesses who are the vast majority of employers in Pennsylvania and nationally, and corporations. And I suppose we're all guilty. I cite the examples of small businesses and small restaurant. Richard and others. You talk about Amazon, and but Jeff Bezos isn't calling me to talk about this legislation. It's usually the smaller businesses. Now there are laws. Some of the laws we've talked about today, which are heralded and rightfully so as kind of the foundation of protecting business, of protecting workers. But even some of those laws have an employee threshold that says you are subject to this law once you have hired this number of people. So the law does make a distinction in various areas between larger companies and small businesses, and I suppose it's just a matter of finding that right balance.
What's the threshold for unionization, the number? Is there a number?
You have to have two people in the bargaining unit,
Right.
and you have to be in interstate commerce. So there's not
A
super
number
high,
employed.
not a super high threshold for union organizing. Many small businesses, many businesses that you would consider to be small businesses, mom and pop shops, can be unionized. And that does present, I think, potentially a significant pressure on those businesses. But just as easily they could, that same pressure on a larger company. I think it's not fair to say, well, big companies bad, small companies good. That's really not.
Yeah.
That
I
doesn't
think
really
the
work.
real question: what's the distribution of unionization across business sizes? I mean, is it or is unionization mostly happening in very large firms, or is this?
It's overwhelmingly with larger businesses. Generally, unions, perhaps trying to be more efficient, say it's not worth our investment of resources, and lawyering to try to organize a place with 5 or 10 employees. So they try to focus on, some unions will say, we're not going to try to unionize a place with fewer than 100 employees. The Starbucks unionization movement is really very different, because most unions say, oh, we don't want to try to unionize a Starbucks with 15, 20, 25 employees, but these workers kind of took it upon themselves and said, we're going to organize ourselves, and they kind of are doing it without the union having to deploy much in the way of union resources and money to do it. So the Starbucks union drive, and I think Alex and Denise might agree, it's really extraordinary among union drives that we've seen in our lifetimes.
Steve, I disagree with that. The pre-Starbucks statistics out of the National Labor Relations Board said that the average size of the bargaining unit in an NLRB election was in the 30s. So I don't think it's fair to say that most of the organizing occurs at larger employers. It doesn't.
I've spoken to many, many, many union leaders over the years, and they say, we don't want to bother with the small shops. Now, if a small shop kind of organizes itself and delivers itself, fine, but they don't. Many of them just don't think it's worth sending 2 organizers for 2 months to organize, 15 people, and then have a lawyer, spending 6 months or a year trying to negotiate a contract.
The way I feel, I think every worker should be unionized. I don't care if it's 1, 2, or a gazillion. Everybody should be. So that's just the way I feel about it.
At a minimum, I guess it's an interesting empirical question, what the distribution looks like across firms. Yeah. Any other, hey, yeah, go ahead. This is one of my students, by the way, so thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here. It's been very thought-provoking, and I appreciate everything that you've all added. I have kind of 2 questions. One's more theoretical, and there's a little more practical for Stephen and for Richard. From a theoretical perspective, I'm interested in what a business or an employer or a corporation that was serious about protecting workers' rights and making room for unionizing efforts, right? If there were such a thing, if there were going to be an employer that was serious about giving the union a seat at the table, what would that look like? What would an employer do to make sure that the workers had the ability to unionize and had the ability to bargain collectively? And then secondly, on a more practical level, what can consumers do to support stores or groups of workers that might be considering a union, in the future? We talk about these Starbucks stores. Are there things that people who shop at Starbucks, people who get a drink at Starbucks, can do to communicate, support in one direction or in favor of a union?
Richard, you could go first if you want.
Okay, so 1903, James Casey went to UPS and said, I need the union, the Teamsters, to come in. I don't think you're going to have too many James Caseys to actually go to the union and say, I want you to represent our employees. So will that happen again around this time? Highly unlikely. I don't think so. But if it did, it would look like something like what he did. He realizes the importance of having a strong workforce, a workforce that's protected, because if you pay workers high enough, show that you care somewhat, then you get the most out of them. So that's how that would look if that were to happen. The consumer part of it, and I don't want nobody to get upset.
It's okay.
Nobody to get upset. So
Why are you looking at me?
So from the consumers, if workers want to organize the shop, withhold your commerce from the shop. Hey, listen, the Starbucks workers want to organize. I'm gonna tell my whole neighborhood not to go to Starbucks until they get a contract. Something like that. We got a UPS contract coming up. Hey, listen, if you don't start treating your workers correctly, we're gonna find another shipper. Things like that you can do.
So first, very good questions. Second, there is a model of employers that welcome unions and treat unions and workers with respect. Germany, Sweden, Denmark, France. In Germany, there's a whole School of Industrial Relations called code determination. And German corporations have their regular board of directors, and above that a supervisory board of directors, which sets general policy for the corporation. And under German law, large corporations have to give a majority minus one, or all of the seats on these supervisory boards to workers, to unions. Workers elect like 49% of the members of these supervisory boards. And I think that's why German companies are generally less anti-union than American companies. They don't outsource as much as American companies. They spend a lot more on employee training than American companies. Plus, German companies have something called works councils, that at each unit, whether an office with 50 people, or a factory with 250 people, or a call center with 500 people, they have works councils where blue-collar workers and white-collar workers and the management have representatives where they, everyone has a voice and discuss, schedules and holidays and workloads and everything. And Germany, companies like Daimler-Benz and BMW and Siemens, I believe they're halfway successful companies, and it shows that with companies where workers have a real voice and say, companies can be very successful. Ditto with Toyota and Honda. They're highly unionized and humongously successful companies. As for the second part of your question about consumers, I think what Richard said was absolutely right. And we've seen this very much during teacher strikes, where in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, in Arizona, the parents, the consumers, the students, the consumers march, arm in arm with the teachers, saying, "We support you in getting higher salaries because that will prevent the exodus of all these teachers to other states. We support you in pushing for smaller class sizes." And with Starbucks, there have been protests. There are 5 unionized Starbucks now in Philadelphia, and several of them have had protests where consumers, Starbucks lovers, have joined them. And I've written that it's unclear whether Starbucks is going to delay for a long time before ever reaching a contract with any of the now 248 Starbucks that are unionized. And if Starbucks really drags its feet on reaching a contract, I think it could face a very big consumer boycott, perhaps resembling the famous United Farm Workers great boycott from a half century ago.
So yeah, Alex, please, if you want to.
Well, maybe not answering the question directly, but I can't kind of help but observe this situation where you're a student of Tristan, the professor.
Yep.
I'm sure you're here to hear. You came to hear an interesting conversation, but I would also hope that, showing your initiative, your interest, perhaps the professor looks kindly upon you come great time. You're showing the initiative. Perhaps I would. I'm a lobbyist. I would lobby for that. And that's the situation in the workplace. Oftentimes, you have individuals who have this drive to get in early, to stay late, to do the extra work, to show up, take on the extra project. In a lot of ways, and that's, don't mean to paint with a broad brush, in a lot of ways, that dynamic is sort of anathema to the labor movement, where so much of it, so much.
That's at the root of everything.
So much. Well, look, I
Yeah.
mentioned before some of the recent issues where the labor community has kind of butted heads with, whether it's the business community or others. Another one had to do with school districts and teachers. And for many years, in the event that a school district had to lay off teachers, it was a policy known as LIFO, last in, first out. The more recent teacher hires were the first ones to be let go. Did they care about the outcomes? The success of the teachers? Were they looking at the outcomes of students, the grades, how successful they were? No. Seniority, last in, first out. We had a Teacher of the Year candidate in Pennsylvania laid off from his job because he happened to fall on the wrong side of that seniority list. I would argue, as a product of, I grew up in Allentown, the product of the Allentown Public Schools, and with kids in public schools in Harrisburg, I'd say, no, I want the best student or the best teacher teaching students. But we couldn't have that because the labor community representing teachers, all of whom are, they're good people. They care passionately about their members, just like Richard does with his members. That was contrary to their approach to the workforce, and they opposed it. So the bottom line is, you absolutely should be getting extra credit for this. And we need Tristan, sort of in the role of employer in a way, being able to take those things into consideration. I think Stephen was going to disagree with me though.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
Yes, I was a reporter at the New York Times for 31 years and a loyal union member. And I and many of the people I work with work their derrieres off, work their asses off, work their butts off every day. Not 8-hour days watching the clock, but 10 and 12-hour days. And sometimes I work till 3 in the morning finishing something. And we're union members, but we also believe in our job. And it's we weren't making widgets. If you're producing widgets, I can imagine the union will insist that if you can work 12 hours or 14 hours if you want, but every hour over 8 you got to be paid overtime. But there are many unionized workplaces, hospitals, nurses, where workers give their all, and unions say we want to make sure you're paid adequately, but we don't want to get in the way of your doing what has to be done to fulfill your mission. So I think some people are too quick to say unions are against people working hard. That's not true. Unions are for people working hard as long as they're rewarded properly for the work they do.
If I can just jump in, because I think
sure.
we should go back and forth, so I'm going to disagree with Stephen. Americans, the Mercedes-Benz model, the BMW model, the Germany model is very, very different from an American workplace. And American workers don't necessarily buy into that. One of the things that we, that has been documented is that people don't always want to give up that autonomy. People feel like they, in the workplace, have control of their own destiny. They may be wrong, they may be right about that, but they often don't want to give it up to a collective group. And so Americans have tended not to be joiners and not to want to do that. In many of the union campaigns that I've been involved in, some of the most outspoken rank and file people in terms of opposing the union are people who formerly worked in a unionized workplace. So that's important to keep in mind. It's a very this sort of a European model that we were talking about, and that seems to work well for Germany, say, is very different than the way American workers think of themselves, the way American workers see themselves. Now, is that going to change? With COVID, will that make people change and think more about collective action? But to date, we have really seen many workers reluctant to join unions, not necessarily just because they think that the employer's bad, is going to fire them, but people who have come from unionized workplaces to a non-union workplace will say, no, don't go that route. It's better here. So you have to take into account the American mindset and the American workforce, and it is a bit different than the European workforce. And I second a lot of what Alex has been saying, but you also have to consider these additional issues when you think about, well, what would work, or what would that workplace look like?
If I may respond civilly in this discourse, as you know, that's true for some workers, and it's very untrue for many other workers. Many workers in the unionized environment feel they have far more autonomy. They have far more courage to speak out when they know they have the protection of the union, when they know that they can't be fired for saying something that the manager disagrees with. Again, in 49 out of 50 American states, there's a doctrine called at-will employment, where the employer could fire you for anything except your race or your religion or your age. If they don't like the color of your shoelaces, if they don't like the way you looked at the boss one morning, you can get fired. So a lot of workers don't feel much autonomy. They're scared. And when there's a union, generally you can only be fired for a good cause, and that's guaranteed under the union contract. So you're right, Denise. There are some workers who say, I'm hot stuff. I could bargain my own contract. I could win raises for myself. I don't need a union bargaining for me. But there are a whole lot of American workers who say, it would be good to have a union. And you've seen the studies by Tom Kochen of MIT, who found 48% of non-union workers say they would want to vote for a union if they could. You've seen the studies by Alex Hortel Fernandez of Columbia saying basically 52% of non-union workers would want to join a union if they could. For workers age 18 to 24, he found 74% of them say they would like to join a union if they could. Among Hispanic workers, 75%. Among African American workers, 80%. Among African American women, 85%. So it's just incorrect to say American workers overall are against unions. If American workers were so overwhelmingly against unions, then why do companies like Amazon and Starbucks spend gazillions of dollars hiring anti-union consultants and lawyers to help pressure workers to vote against the union? If they really thought workers were anti-union, they would just leave the workers alone and let them vote down unions on their own.
So we've got about 5 minutes, I think, left. Maybe it would be good if everyone wanted to say a few final remarks, keeping in mind we've got 5 minutes, and just kind of whatever you think is important for the audience to kind of keep in mind and take away if possible. Yeah.
I don't know, I think I probably talked enough. I don't know if I have
You
anything,
can pass if you like,
anything
yeah.
more to say, but I do think, just to make the point that that there are often, as you grow up and mature in life, you see that there are often two sides to every story, and sometimes more than two. And in a unionized situation, in a union election, I think, step back and think there are often 2 or 3 sides to that story as well.
Thanks.
Thanks, and I want to just thank you again for inviting me to be here today. I really have a tremendous amount of respect, certainly for Stephen, but Richard, in particular, advocating on behalf of his members. We obviously have different constituencies. We come at it from different perspectives, but we are passionate advocates for our members, and I think ultimately we are striving towards similar goals of a strong economy, good paying jobs for Pennsylvanians. I spent a lot of time talking about all these various issues where I find our organization kind of butting heads with the labor community, but I could have spent an equal amount of time talking about issues where we're working very closely together, partnering on things like infrastructure and economic development, and trying to attract these big corporations to Pennsylvania where they can hire 10,000 construction workers over 3 years to build their facilities. There is much more agreement and overlap than it probably seems. Maybe this conversation didn't help that too much, but I do want to make sure that point is made clear. And I really applaud Drexel and the school for its emphasis on civility and being able to talk passionately about issues, disagree without being disagreeable. I think that is something that is just so important to emphasize, and a real pleasure to be here with you all and kind of be able to emphasize that message. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, go ahead, Stephen.
Alex, I don't think you've been disagreeable at all. So, and it's really been a pleasure here, and it's great to participate in this discourse. My sense is, a lot of Americans, especially young Americans, feel something's broken in the economy. They see all this income inequality. They watch, baseball, football, and see all these ads to buy Mercedes or go on European cruises, and they say, I can't begin to afford that. There's something wrong. We hear that we'll be the first generation in American history to do worse than their parents, and I think a lot of, young Americans, aren't lucky enough to go to Drexel, aren't lucky enough to go to college, and they're thinking, how can I improve my life? And one thing they think about is unions might be a way to lift our, to improve our lives. And a lot of college graduates, whether museum workers or graduate student workers, agree that unions are for them. And Alex and Denise are right, there are problems with unions. There's too much corruption. There's too much discrimination towards women and minorities for years. But unions right now, they've generally gotten their act together much more than before. And they're much more attuned, I think, to what young workers want. And, there's a lot of excitement right now for unions, and there's a big tug of war because companies are pushing back very hard against unions, so it's hard to know exactly what this moment will mean. Will it really create a lasting surge for unions, or will it blow over in a year or two? And thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming. And
Well, thanks to everybody for coming out. This has been awesome. I would just say this, Fred Hampton said something. He said, anywhere there's people, there's power. Anywhere there's workers, there's power. And I think what has happened over the last 2.5 years with this pandemic, the workers have finally saw that they have power. And if you guys see a strike, please join it. Don't cross the picket lines, please. Those workers are fighting for something that they don't have, that they need, and not just for their family, but for the generations to come. So this just been awesome, and I would love to come back and do this again. But again, vote union.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me thank Christian for doing such a wonderful job.
Yeah, absolutely,
Oh, you're welcome.
Really seamless, but this has been one of our better panels. I mean, this has really been a wonderful panel. The way in which you spoke across various points of view with civility,
Yeah.
agreeableness,
Right.
but I learned so much from this.
Thank you.
I don't know what I think exactly, but I think it's actually
That's a good thing, right? Yeah.
and I really look forward to perhaps doing a follow-up, but we are going to stream this, and I hope we can figure out a way to get people to watch it, because I think the American public needs to hear you speak. It will also help them. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you.
And have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Alex and Denise.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Stephen.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.